I'm Amanda Pizzollo. I go by Amanda, just dropped the first A. I don't really know why that started, but I've known my whole life. And like she said, I'm from SLIS West. And I'm going to talk a little bit about services for refugees in the public library setting. I do have kind of picture-heavy slides, so I'm going to try to just describe anytime pictures do come up. Just so you guys know a little bit about me, I, like many other library students, I'm a career changer, so I've been a nurse for about 10 years now. And as a nurse, I worked a lot with healthcare reform and changing the medical system to account for our vulnerable populations and just for everyone in our communities, including refugees. When I was in Burlington, Vermont, I was a refugee resettlement volunteer. A lot of my friends were refugees, so I got interested in this topic in nursing, and now, of course, I'm also interested in library and information science. Unfortunately, the literature is not great yet, by the way, on this topic, but there are a lot of resources from librarians kind of in the field and news articles now happening, so hopefully there will be more published literature. And since this is really just a conversation starter, not kind of an extensive overview of the whole topic, feel free to use that Find Out More section and maybe publish your own articles if it's possible. So the first two pictures I have on this first slide, I have one from the Digital Public Library of America, where there are children outside of the library and they're holding up signs of all the languages and materials that the library has. And then I have a picture of two refugee children at a refugee camp in Jordan. So first we're just going to do a little bit of a context about who refugees are, what that term means, and there's more about certain terms that are good to know on the handout itself as well. So as far as who refugees are, surprise, refugees are human beings. I say this because we have a photograph up on the screen right now that has a sign that says refugees are human beings. The other photograph is refugees in El Paso, Texas from the 1910s, again from the Digital Public Library of America collection. So refugee is a legal term, and I have the full definition on your handout from the 1951 Refugee Convention. But basically refugees are people who've had to flee their homes because of persecutory reasons. They had to leave to either preserve their life or their freedom, and they had to flee to another country. They're not the only forcibly displaced people in the world. Worldwide, there's about 59.2 million forcibly displaced people. And within the forcibly displaced, there are also internally displaced persons, IDPs, and there are asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are people who claim to be refugees, but they don't apply for the status until they've already moved to a third country. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by third country. So if you're a refugee, if you've had to flee your country because of persecution, your first stop will be in a neighboring country. You also call it an asylum country. You'll probably reside in a refugee camp there. Refugee camps are meant to be transitory shelter. They're really just meant for very temporary, and they're just meant to supply basic human needs. But many refugees will spend years or decades or even die in refugee camps before waiting on a third option. So the next step would be one of three options. Voluntary repatriation, where you're able to go back to your home country because you'll be able to have basic human rights there again and safety, or a certain level of safety. The second option is local integration. So in that country that you first sought asylum, they can reach an agreement with that country, and then you'll be integrated into that country. And then the third option is resettlement. This is the last resort, and it's the least common, and resettlement is into the third country, I mentioned before, like the United States. Only 1% of the global refugee population is resettled into a third country. And the United States, which is kind of what we're going to talk about in terms of public libraries, because we're in the US right now, is the world's top resettlement country, actually, and we only have about 250,000 refugees. And there's about over 19 million worldwide refugees. We also have a little bit less than that, but a pretty similar number in terms of asylum seekers. So I kind of just automatically say refugees over and over again, but really when I'm talking about the strategies for serving everybody in our community, I'm talking about hopefully strategies that will particularly help the information needs of any forced migrants in our community, so including asylum seekers. I don't want to go into a lot of the context about what's currently happening climate-wise with refugees worldwide, mostly because if I start talking about it, I'll talk about it for a very long time. But I just do want to say the world's top 3 producers of refugees, so countries from which the most people are fleeing and getting refugee status, are Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, in that order. And those three countries alone account for about 52% of the world's refugees. Afghanistan was the world's top producer of refugees for 32 years in a row until 2014 when Syria became the top producer. And I won't talk about the Syrian refugee crisis because then we'll really be here for a long time. But I highly encourage you to find out more in the context. So I do want to spend some time talking about strategies for providing service. All the strategies I'm going to talk about, these are things that we're already doing in the public library setting. If you can't tell, I'm in the general tract, and I'm strongly leaning towards public libraries. But I just want to kind of bring up some ideas for how to tailor our services to make sure we account for everybody in our population, in our community, including forced migrants. One strategy that you will note that I didn't kind of separate out is the combined strategy of raising awareness and advocacy, which I think really is the most important strategy. But we accomplish that first by raising our own awareness, which we're all kind of doing a little bit now, and then also with these other strategies that we're going to talk about. So the first one is collaboration. So I have a picture here of a spider web. So I worked in public health and human services for years in healthcare. And one thing that I found, I was a rural child health coordinator, I did all these coalitions. One thing I found is that there's always a support web, a support network in every community. And it's amazing. Once you sit on one of these coalitions and you get into this support web, you suddenly realize what is really available. It might be very bureaucratic, it might be very annoying. It might mean to get help with housing that you have to go all this way around the web and then you have to jump to another section of it. But it is there. You just need to know about it because, from outside a spider web, sometimes you can't even see it, and you certainly don't know where to enter to get into that whole network. So the top thing the kind of easiest way for libraries to make sure that they start getting into the support web for refugees is to know your local VOLAG. So VOLAG just stands for Voluntary Agency. The government works with a group of private agencies to help support refugees when they're resettled here. And then when a refugee first comes, you'll have a VOLAG caseworker who's funded at least for 90 days, who helps with basic supports with food, shelter, housing, medical necessities, employment applications. And just so you guys know, as far as employment applications go, refugees have the right to work as soon as they're here, and they're pretty much required or heavily suggested to have a job within 6 months of being here. So that certainly is important. So having a representative from your local VOLAG come and do a staff training at your library is really key. Just knowing your VOLAG, knowing that they know that you want to be in the support web, and then they can help kind of link you with everybody else in the support web. And you can kind of think of your traditional human services organizations, churches, volunteers as within the support web, but we're also librarians, so we can think a little bit creatively too. For instance, the Whitehall Public Library in Pennsylvania, they worked with the local artists who did an exhibit with portraits and stories of local refugees, and it was really powerful and beautiful, and it was a great partnership. So our next strategy is direct service. I have a picture of an ESL class in the library on the screen right now. And by direct service, I mean these things that we're already doing in the library when you orient someone to the library, when you help somebody at the computer, when you help somebody with a job application, when you have an ESL class or a civics class in the library. Again, things that we're already doing for everybody, just making sure that they're as accessible as possible to forced migrants in our community too. So one thing that you can do is know that refugees come from a variety of backgrounds, educationally wise. So you may have someone who has a doctorate in their home country, and you may have someone who's illiterate in the same ESL class. Making sure your ESL teacher knows that, which a lot of ESL teachers are used to providing for a variety of backgrounds anyway, but also potentially having more classes, having a civics class, having a packet for legal permanent resident status applications when you know refugees are ready for that. You can apply as a refugee, you can apply for legal permanent resident status after a year of being here and 5 years of being here. You can apply for naturalization. The next slide is this is a Japanese OPAC, and I'm a pseudo library and information science professional, and I couldn't do anything with this. I couldn't navigate this because I don't speak, write, or understand Japanese. So it's just a reminder that it doesn't really matter your educational background. If you don't know the language or you don't know a system, you're not going to know how to navigate it. So trying to make things as navigable as possible. This is a link that I can't get time for it. But another good example of kind of tailoring direct service, so we talked about orientation to the library. So Pima County Library in Tucson, which is one of my old haunts, they worked with 2 refugee support agencies, a local nonprofit religious group, the Department of Anthropology at the local school, and then individual immigrants and refugees in the community who volunteered to make a website called Welcome to the Library, and they have a list of videos that are in all the most common languages for refugees there. And it's really cool and it's fun to find out. So our next strategy is collection development. Again, something we're already doing in the public library. The first step of any collection development should be community needs assessment. And so if you do a community needs assessment, and if the VOLAG knows that you're there, so they can tell forced migrants in your community that you're going to be a support there, hopefully you're going to be hearing directly from patrons as far as what you should collect. But some general ideas. One thing that any library, even libraries who don't have refugees residing in the community, can do to help promote global consciousness and raise awareness would be to have materials that detail refugee experiences. So one of my pictures is I have a few books that do this. My favorite is What is the What? Because that's what started my journey as a refugee resettlement volunteer. Next I have another picture of Burqa Avenger. So another thing you can do, it doesn't have to be directly refugee experiences, but just diversifying your collection in general, which is something, again, hopefully we're all already doing. Burqa Avenger is a Pakistani cartoon, and she's really awesome, and she's gaining worldwide popularity. She's a teacher, and she also fights evil with pens and books. Unfortunately, she's not super easy to get videos of for your collection yet, but I put her up there because I have hopes. And then, of course, addressing the information needs of forced migrants in your community. So things like directional services maps, things like a list of translation services, a list of healthcare providers, entertainment and informational resources in their own language, English language learning resources, and finding and communicating with lost relatives can be really important, because even though the government does try to resettle refugees near family members, it does not always happen. So the last picture that I have on here, Birmingham City Council in the UK had a really great webpage called Library Services for Refugees and Asylum Seekers. I say it had a really great page. It's still there, but it's not as great because a lot of the links are broken because their organizations no longer exist that they link to. But one of the cool things that they do have on that page is they have just a couple PDF documents that are charts of libraries in the area and then languages of resources in those libraries. So it doesn't, even though I kind of did a long list, a lot of those things are things that your VOLAG might have and you might just need to link to them, and also things that we can do online or things that we're already providing. The next slide is just a picture of a quote on a wall that's "Home is not where you live, but where they understand you." Just to remind us, again, of the importance of awareness and advocacy, in the hopes that increasing understanding increases acceptance and strengthens our community. And then the last strategy would be space. So again, we're already doing. Libraries are increasingly becoming more about the community space than about just the collection within that community space. So I have 3 pictures again. The first picture, well actually, the last picture, depending on which way you start, is a couple of people just studying in a library. So a lot of what refugees have said they want in their library space is the same thing all of your other patrons want: a welcoming environment, a quiet space, a space where you can use the computer, and a space with resources. One thing I will say is you can think about, to make it an even more welcoming environment for forced migrants, have signs, welcome signs in other languages, have directional signs with pictures. And then there's also something to kind of keep an eye on. There's trauma-informed communities. So that's a theory and model. It's really mostly in healthcare and in mental health right now, but I think it has a lot of potential to help strengthen our communities and help us be more supportive of anyone who's experienced trauma, and certainly forced migrants have experienced trauma and are now in an overwhelming transition in their first year. So hopefully that will kind of progress into other fields, including our own. The middle picture there is from that Whitehall Public Library exhibit that I told you about, and it's a picture of a boy taking a picture of his portrait from that exhibit. So having a space for events like that one. And then the last picture that I haven't mentioned yet is from from a World Refugee Day event, Hartford Public Library in Connecticut is pretty good with their resources for immigrants and for refugees. And that picture has people dancing at this event for World Refugee Day, which is June 20th. So on that day, they had an event called A Tribute to the Uncomfortable Spirit of Hartford County's Refugees. They had an ethnic craft fair, they had informational booths, they had a lot of food, they had dancing, and then they had a public discussion about refugees. Seattle Public Library also had a really great World Refugee Day that they did a podcast of. So thinking about using our space to host events like that, that brings our whole community together, and then also to promote those events. So my last slide used to have a picture of me with some of my friends who are refugees, and it was our first meal together, and it was just a really great night. But they really didn't want their faces up here. So now it just says community. Because this is just a reminder, it's really hard when we're talking about serving vulnerable populations to not sound like us serving them. But this really isn't about that. It's just about strengthening our community. It's about coming together as a community, and it's about making sure that we do our jobs as public librarians, which is to serve everyone within our community. Welcome. Any questions or comments?